You spent 12 years in a classroom, thousands of hours, hundreds of texts, and when you walked out the other side, nobody had taught you how to pay taxes. Nobody explained how loans work or what interest actually does to you over time. Nobody told you how to negotiate a salary, read a contract, understand your rights, manage your mental health, or build anything that actually lasts. But you knew the exact date of every major war. You could recite the periodic table, you could calculate the area of a triangle, and then you stepped into the real world and realized none of it came with the instructions. And you assumed that was an accident, a gap, an oversight, something they forgot to include. But what if it was an accident? What if the things you were never taught were left out on purpose? And what if the things you were taught instead were chosen just as deliberately? Most people assume the education system is broken, underfunded, poorly designed, run by people who mean well but just haven't figured it out yet. And the solution seems obvious: better teachers, more money, updated curriculums, fix the broken system, and everything gets better. But here's the problem with that assumption: a broken system fails by accident. What if the system is succeeding exactly as intended? Because the modern education system wasn't built by accident, it was designed deliberately by specific people with specific goals, and those goals were never written on any classroom wall. In 1852, the United States adopted its compulsory education model almost directly from Prussia, a military state that had developed its school system for one explicit purpose: to produce obedient soldiers and compliant factory workers who followed orders without question. The architects of American education didn't hide this, they wrote it down, and what they wrote should make every person who ever sat in a classroom deeply uncomfortable. In 1888, the National Education Association commissioned a report that would shape American schooling for the next century. The man behind it was William Torrey Harris, United States Commissioner of Education, and Harris was unusually honest about what he believed schools were actually for. He wrote that the purpose of education was to alienate the child from their own individuality, to make them subordinate to the social whole. His words, not a critic looking back. The architect himself describing the intention. And Harris wasn't alone. John D. Rockefeller's General Education Board, founded in 1903, stated its mission plainly. The goal was not to produce thinkers, it was to produce workers for the existing industrial economy. Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management, published his principles in 1911, arguing that workers should execute tasks efficiently without needing to understand why. Schools were restructured around exactly that model: bells to signal movement, rows to enforce compliance, grades to rank and sort, strict schedules to eliminate independent thought, punishment for deviation, reward for conformity. Every element of the classroom you grew up in was inherited directly from a system that was never designed to make you smarter. It was designed to make you manageable, and the people who designed it said so. So, what does a system designed for compliance actually do to the brain? Neuroscientist Marian Diamond at UC Berkeley spent decades studying brain development and found one thing that consistently grew: new neural connections in every brain she studied: novelty, exploration, the freedom to ask questions without knowing the answer in advance. The exact opposite of what a standardized classroom delivers. Because standardized testing doesn't measure intelligence, it measures how well you memorized what someone else decided was worth knowing. And the research is unambiguous. A 2019 study published in the journal Mind, Brain and Education found that creative thinking ability in children consistently declined the longer they stayed in formal schooling, not improved, declined. Sorkin Robinson's landmark 2006 analysis of global education systems found that every country on earth ranked mathematics and language at the top and arts and creative subjects at the bottom, without exception. Not because creativity is less valuable, because creativity is harder to control. A creative mind asks why, a compliant mind asks how, and the system only ever needed the second question answered. And here is what it did to you specifically. Psychologist George Land ran a creativity test originally developed for NASA to identify innovative engineers and scientists. He gave the same test to 1,600 children. At 5 years old, 98% scored at genius level for creative thinking. At 10 years old, that number dropped to 30%. At 15, it dropped to 12%. The same test, the same measurement given to the same children as they moved through the education system. By the time most people reach adulthood, only 2% score at genius level for creativity. The 98% didn't lose their creativity because they grew up. They lost it because it was systematically trained out of them. Land's conclusion was direct: non creative behavior is learned, and school is where most of us learned it. But the damage goes deeper than creativity. Psychologist Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania identified a phenomenon he called learned helplessness. When a person is repeatedly subjected to outcomes they cannot control, regardless of their behavior, they eventually stop trying altogether. They don't stop trying because they're lazy. They stop trying because their brain has learned that trying doesn't change anything. Seligman's research found that the traditional classroom, where grades are assigned by someone else, rules are set by someone else, schedules are controlled by someone else, and deviation is punished, is one of the most efficient environments ever designed for producing learned helplessness in otherwise capable human beings. You weren't taught that you couldn't think yourself. You were just placed in a system where thinking for yourself never changed the outcome, and your brain drew the only logical conclusion it could. So here is what nobody tells you after all of that, and this time it isn't comfortable. The system worked, not on everyone, but on enough people that it never had to change. Because a population that never learned to question authority is easier to govern. A workforce that never developed independent thinking is easier to manage. A consumer base that never learned financial literacy is easier to exploit. And a citizen who spent 12 years being rewarded for compliance and punished for deviation will carry that programming into every job, every relationship, and every voting booth they ever walk into, without ever knowing it was installed. But here is the other side of that, and this part matters. Every person who ever changed anything, every scientist who overturned an accepted theory, every artist who created something the world has never seen, every entrepreneur who built something from nothing, every activist who shifted the direction of history, did it by doing the one thing school spent years training out of them. They questioned the answer they were given. They trusted their own thinking over the authority in the room. They refused to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. The creativity that George Land measured at 98% when you were 5 years old, it isn't gone. It was suppressed. Suppression and deletion are not the same thing. What was trained into you can be trained out. What was closed can be reopened. The 2% who retained their creative genius into adulthood didn't have something the rest didn't. They just never fully believed the system when it told them what they were worth. You were handed a map the day you started school, and the map was useful, but it was never the whole territory, and the most important parts of the territory were never on it. You were never stupid. You were never incapable. You were never a C student or a slow learner or someone who just wasn't cut out for it. You were a creative, curious, questioning human being who was handed a system that needed you to be something smaller. And you were young enough and trusting enough to believe it when it told you what you were. The grade was never a measurement of your mind, it was a measurement of your compliance. And the fact that you're still asking questions, still curious, still wondering whether the world is exactly what you were told it was, that isn't a sign that school failed you. That's proof it didn't completely finish the job.